Okay, my title is essentially, what should we teach? And what I'm going to argue for essentially is that we should have academic freedom to allow instructors to be able to make many of these judgments on their own, and I'll explain why I feel that's true. Is this working? Oh. Okay, my own view. My own view is religion as traditionally defined should not be taught in a science class. Every now and then students bring it up, and I try to get them off of this topic. In science, we're talking about science. We're not talking about religion. But that's a personal view. I also have a problem with punishing and firing teachers who violate what I feel is appropriate to do in a science class. Just yesterday, there was a teacher, science teacher, who taught, according to the newspaper reports at least, taught that Darwinism was connected to both Nazism, racism, and the Holocaust. Now, I'm not sure what he presented, but I know this is an area I've studied quite in depth, and it's pretty clear to me, the evidence historical evidence is very clear that Darwinism indeed is very strongly connected to those three subjects. Well, he was fired as a teacher because they felt this was inappropriate to teach in a science class. And to me, that's a very important topic which should be taught in a science class. My own experience is when I student taught in the high school level in Oak Park, Michigan, one of the teachers, the most esteemed teacher in the school, as a student teacher, I went around and listened to other teachers, and they put me in the classrooms of the best teachers. And one of the best teachers happens to be a rabbi. And he presented, in fact, I don't even remember now specifically what he talked about, but I know my respect for Judaism increased considerably after this presentation. And he talked about, it was a science class, he talked about religion quite a bit in this class. And I went to 2 or 3 of the classes that he taught. It seemed to me more theology than science. Kids loved him. I learned from him. No one complained, so I thought, what's the problem? Another example was a student at a medical university. One of my professors was a Muslim. Now, this again was a science class. He took about a half an hour, 45 minutes, and talked about the Muslim faith. And I didn't know much at that time about the Muslim faith, and turned out I appreciated what he had to say. And I talked to several other students, and they did as well. There's a lot of misconceptions about both Judaism and the Muslim faith, and even though it wasn't relevant to the class, I appreciated what he had to say. And my own background, I was reared by an atheist father and a Jehovah's Witness mother. My father was an engineer and very active, I should state, in the ACLU. As a young child, I was, drug is the best word, I guess, to the ACLU meetings, sat there as a 5-year-old, and not sure I learned much. I do remember a few things, specifically from the meetings. And the connections with the ACLU is pretty close in our family. In fact, Lester Mondale, who was the half-brother of Walter Mondale, the former vice president, married my father and my stepmother. College, I majored in science, and the more I learned about science, the more disillusioned I became with the Jehovah's Witnesses. The blood issue bothered me quite a bit. I saw Jehovah's Witnesses dying because the Jehovah's Witnesses refused to take blood transfusions. And I couldn't find any justification for this, either in the Watchtower literature or in the scriptures. And I continued to study the issue of Darwinism, though, even though I became an atheist. In fact, I was quite involved in the atheist movement for a number of years. I knew quite a few leading atheists. Marilyn Mary O'Hara was an interesting person. I had some good experiences and I was cautious. She had quite a temper, I found, and learned a lot from her, but most of the atheists I associate with, I had good relations, and I had a good experience. But I became disillusioned with the atheists for a number of reasons. One reason was the issue of Darwinism. They really spent a lot of time pushing Darwinism, or some people prefer the word evolution. I have a problem with that word because creationists believe in evolution. That's not the debate. The debate is beyond that. And then as I was doing work for both my first doctorate and was working on a third PhD in molecular biology at Medical University, and the more I studied, the more disillusioned I became with the orthodox Darwinist position. I looked at specifically the issue of vestigial organs. There were most evolution books that I looked at, most biology books as well. They claim there are around 100 vestigial organs. I investigated each one of these and found that all of these so-called vestigial organs had very important functions. Many had critically important functions. Some, of course, were less important than others, but you can line up all the organs and find some, like the heart's very important, others, like toes, are less important. So that's not the concern. I looked at homology, the biogenic law, and mutations especially, because the work I did at the medical university was in cancer research. And of course, cancer is essentially a disease caused by mutations. It's a genetic disease which we're looking at mutations. So I looked quite a bit at mutations in my experience at graduate school at medical university. Looked at fossil record, sources of genetic variation, evolution of the eye, and so on. And I concluded in each of these cases, the evidence, scientific evidence, not religious evidence, but the scientific evidence supported not the Darwinist worldview, but the creation worldview. And by evolution, I mean from the goo to you by way of the zoo. And it's important to keep that definition in mind, again, because creationists have no problem with evolution. In fact, creationists, if you're a young age creationist, you have to have faster evolution. So an article is coming out talking about how fast evolution can be. Creationists find those articles useful because they're looking for rapid evolution. My concern is can mutations selected by natural selection explain all life forms? Certainly mutations explain a lot, but can they explain all life forms? And my conclusion is, indeed, they cannot. How many Darwin skeptics are there? A lot of reports. I have a whole study here which I did. I quoted a number of leading scientists which said that there are no scientists that support creation. There are no Darwin skeptics at all. Well, a survey by Harvard professor Neil Gross found that about 113,000 professors in the United States are in favor or support intelligent design. So that's a huge number of people. In fact, 31% of all community college professors support intelligent design. I had a student that had an interest in this. He's headed for law school, so I said, well, why don't you do a survey of our faculty? And he did, and he found of our science professors, 33% were creationist, 22% supported ID, 22% theistic evolution, and 22% were atheist. So that was the spread in our school and of the science faculty. And he also now is doing a survey of students. And he found so far that over 90% of our students self-label themselves as creationists. So there's a sizable number out there that question orthodox Darwinism. I have a list now, which I'm collecting myself, of 3,000 PhD scientists, mostly professors, actually, many are scientists as well, who are Darwin skeptics. And I interviewed many of them. I have a list right here. And I interviewed many of them. And one thing I found, with rare exceptions, all faced some type of discrimination. Many faced denial of degrees, denial of tenure, denial of promotion, denial of grants, loss of position. There wasn't one single person I interviewed, and I interviewed probably a third of my list, that didn't experience problems. And I started to compile a manuscript, which is up to 900 pages, where I document the discrimination that these people face. Now, some of these people, by the way, are not creationists, they're not religious. A number are atheists, but they question Darwinism. And as a result, their careers have been seriously adversely affected. In fact, I'm on a talk group now of about 400, mostly professors and scientists, and we talk a lot about the problems that we have in academia and elsewhere with questioning Darwinism. And it's pretty well agreed among our group that the only way, or the main way, you can survive in academia at least, is to stay in the closet. So even among our group, which is only insiders, personally invited to be part of that group, a number of our people use pseudonyms because they're afraid that their doubts about Darwin will get out and they'll end up being denied the degree or other problems. A U.S. government report, excellent report, by the way, right here, excellent report, long report, said at the Smithsonian, which is what they investigated, quote, officials have made it clear their intent to prevent any scientist publicly skeptical of Darwinian theory from ever being appointed as a research associate, no matter how sterling his or her professional credentials or research. And there have been 3 or 4 cases at the Smithsonian who have been poorly mistreated because of their doubts about Darwin. And one, it's interesting in the report, they're trying to find out where he was at religiously, and also politically. And they accused him of being a Republican, which I didn't know it was a crime, but that's part of the report. A major ID plank is called irreducible complexity. All this says is that 2 or more parts are required for something to function. You take 1 or more parts away, it doesn't function. And the courts have ruled that irreducible complexity is religion, specifically. And the claim that ID has been refuted is common. I did a Google search and I found 49,000 hits for the phrase irreducible complexity has been refuted. And I didn't read all of them, but I checked the number, and basically they said that this concept has been scientifically refuted. In Francis Isla wrote, quoting Judge Jones, irreducible complexity has been refuted in peer-reviewed research. And I thought about this, and this is absurd. It's absurd. Good example, I teach chemistry. You will not have carbon unless you have, for a carbon-12 atom, not an ion, you must have 6 protons, 6 neutrons, and 6 electrons. It is irreducibly complex. You will not have carbon unless you have those parts. Must have those parts to have carbon. How can one say that irreducible complexity has been refuted scientifically? Fine, then show me an atom, say, that has 5 protons, that is a carbon, that has all the chemical traits of carbon. This is ludicrous. A better example is everything in the universe is irreducibly complex except what they call fundamental particles, the quarks, leptons, electrons, and so on. And they claim nothing is irreducibly complex. One must get anything and everything from a single fundamental particle. And an example I use is, can you get a Cadillac from a single quark that functions totally as a Cadillac? People say, well, that's an extreme example. Well, can you? Another example is, can you get a human that functions totally as a human, can reproduce, have children, etc., that consists of one quark? You can't. Humans are clearly irreducibly complex. In fact, everything is irreducibly complex except the fundamental particles. And what is taught in the schools? I did a survey now, I'm still in the progress of doing this, but I'm calling up teachers, both the high school and the college level, and I'm just asking them, what do you teach in this area? And I found it's not a question of what is taught. Okay, it's not a question of if it is taught, if creationism is taught, but what is taught. And most of the high school teachers that I talked to, and college teachers, said they teach that God directed and used evolution, that the means of creation God used was evolution. I never say that in my classes. That's religion as far as I'm concerned. And yet none of these teachers have had any problems teaching that. To me, they should stay out of religion and teach pure science. Yet, a high percent of the teachers who cover this subject, many avoid it because they want to avoid legal problems. But the teachers that talk about this say, well, we're talking about evolution, but God's behind it all, which to me is theology. It's religion. So it's not a matter of whether creation will be taught, it's a matter of what will be taught about creationism. My anthropology book here, which I use, taught by a good old University of Michigan man, Dr. Kotek, it's got a whole page on intelligent design versus evolutionary theory. It teaches, in this case, intelligent design. And as far as I know, he hasn't any problems with this. So it's not a matter of can you teach it, it's a matter of what do you teach about it. If teaching intelligent design is religion, okay, and it cannot be taught in science, then teaching against intelligent design is teaching against religion, and therefore it cannot also be taught. Either you can teach information for it and against it, or neither side. And this is what Wendell Bird argued in a couple of law journal articles a few years ago in the Yale Law Journal and the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy. Says, be wrong to teach against it. You must be neutral regarding matters of religion. And a lot of teachers I talk to, they just avoid the whole subject, which I don't think solves the problem either. And I know of no one fired for teaching intelligent design is wrong. Yet, as I said, there's a huge number of people I found that have been terminated for teaching the opposite. So it's legal to teach design is an illusion. That's legal. But to teach that design is real, which is what intelligent design stresses, that's illegal. So it's illegal to teach one side, but not the other side. Basically, what intelligent design says is that design is real. Okay? What Darwinists teach is that design we see is an illusion. Ron Numbers, who is I respect him highly, he's at a university not too far from here, he says U.S. public schools must be religiously neutral. And more people, prominent people like Richard Dawkins, say evolution demands atheism. And Numbers is concerned that people like Dawkins are going to undercut the ability of American schools to teach evolution. More and more people are saying, 3 bestsellers this year alone, basically say that evolution is the doorway to atheism. You cannot be consistent and be an evolutionist and be a theist. They're inconsistent. And Numbers is worried about this because he realizes this could undercut what he wants, which is to teach, of course, evolution. Dr. Gregory Graffin, he has his PhD from Cornell, and his thesis, he surveyed 151 professors, and he found 98% of the prominent biologists, they were all prominent scientists, he in his list there, 98% of prominent biologists were functional atheists. 8.7 described themselves as cultural Christians, and 84% rejected all theistic evolution. And his study concluded evolution is a replacement for theism. So we're talking about 98% were what I call functional atheists, although some were cultural Christians. And the evidence is clear, and this is the work that I'm doing in conjunction with my work at the medical school. We must follow the evidence. And that clearly requires, I feel, the freedom to research the topic. It's true some teachers are going to abuse the classroom and going to teach religion. They're going to proselytize religion. But I think the other side, where we're now, is doing more harm than good. I'm uncomfortable being in a classroom where a teacher talks about religion as a whole. But you just grin it and get over and move on. And when I close, I want to read one quote from Principles of Medical Biochemistry. And the implications of this are pretty obvious. I'll just read it. Every child is born with an estimated 100 to 200 new mutations that were not present in the parents. Okay? Estimated 1 to 2 mutations are mildly detrimental. This means they're not bad enough to cause a disease on their own. Okay? Goes on and says children are on the average a little sicker than their parents because they have new mutations on top of those inherited from their parents. Now what that says, in fact, the title of an article makes it quite clear, says mutational meltdown in sexual populations. Now they recognize this in asexual populations, but we now see this in evidence in this in sexual populations. Mutational meltdown means we're accumulating mutations. What that means is that evolution is going backward. Is that legal to teach? The implications are very clear. It's going backward, then how did it get wound up? Evolution's going the wrong way. How did we get where we were 100 years ago? The religious implications are clear from that. Technically, this, in Pennsylvania at least, this page would be illegal because students pick up right away what it means and what it refers to. So thus I oppose all attempts to censor criticism of Darwinism. We must have the right in our schools and colleges to be able to openly criticize Darwinism. And by the way, it's all over the place. Current Newsweek, excellent job criticizing Darwin. I think I'd have trouble if in a public school in Pennsylvania if I tried to introduce that. Another magazine, again, does an excellent job. If you haven't seen this, every single article is excellent in Wired magazine. If you brought this into the schools, I think you'd have some problems, at least in Pennsylvania. Maybe not in Michigan, but in Pennsylvania. Thank you very much. Oh, yeah. Where'd it go? Here we go.
Great, thank you very much. And I have to apologize, first of all, to Dr. Bergman for standing behind me. I'm a walker. I can't sit and talk at the same time, so I apologize for that. What I'd like to do today, in my very short presentation, it's hard for 2 academic professors to get up and do anything in 20 minutes, because usually we're gifted with the hour and a half, so we'll do the best that we can here. What I want to look at is the issue, which is the issue tonight, is not one of academic freedom, but does intelligent design, in fact, has it in fact earned its place in the college classroom? Should it be taught in a publicly funded classroom? And that really is the question I want to address tonight. And so, whoa, that was probably bad. So what we want to do here is come back and take a look at our first question, which is really going to be, what constitutes science? Because that's really the issue here, is does intelligent design constitute science? And if it does, maybe it has in fact earned a place in the classroom. So that's really the question here tonight. Has it earned its place in the publicly funded science classroom? But first, before we start that, we have to recognize, and I think that the doctor and I are on the same page here, there are many important forms of human inquiry. That science is only but one form of human inquiry. We also have theology. We also have philosophy, because science cannot address all questions. But the salient question here tonight is, do those forms of human inquiry belong in the science classroom? So before we can have that conversation, we need to figure out, well, what constitutes science? So let's take it a ruling here, a seminal case in this whole issue here of creationism, intelligent design, evolution, is a case here from Judge William Overton, very famous case, 1982, McLean versus Arkansas Board of Education, which really addressed that question, is should creation science be allowed in the classroom? But the court case focused around, well, what's creation science? And in fact, is it science? And more importantly, what constitutes science? So this is my language I'm using to reflect the judge's decision here. And what the judge said, I don't know why we're having a problem here, was that science has to be guided rather by natural law. This is what science seeks to do. We try and explain the world around us with reference to natural law, not supernatural intervention. Science isn't saying there isn't supernatural intervention. We're just saying that that's not how science addresses the world. We can only seek to explain what we see around us with reference to natural law. Let me try this here and see if we can get this going. I don't know what our problem here is. Let's see here. So how do we do that? For instance, if your daughter comes to you and says, Dad, can you please tell me where rainbows come from? If you conjure up images of men in little green suits and pots of gold, and that's not a scientific explanation, because scientific explanations have to make reference to natural law. Laws of physics, laws of chemistry, geology, biology, etc. So if we say, well, rainbows come from droplets of water in the atmosphere acting as prisms that take white light and fraction out its component parts, that's a scientific explanation. And this is how scientists approach the world, is assuming that there's only natural causation. It doesn't mean that there aren't supernatural causations, but that's outside the realm of science. So we always have to look for natural explanations. And science has to be testable. It has to be testable. It has to be testable. Science has to be testable against the empirical world, and therefore potentially falsifiable. What if it's not testable? For instance, people commonly say, Dr. Forbes, what do you think about life after death? And I go, sign me up, I'm all for it. And they go, so that means that science says there is life after death? No, science doesn't say that. So science says there is no life after death. No, science doesn't say that either. How come? Because that hypothesis that there's life after death isn't what? Testable. So we give that to the theologians. We give that to the philosophers. It's outside the realm of science if it's not testable. Doesn't mean that theology and philosophy is a lesser form of human inquiry. Absolutely not. It's just a different approach to try and explain our world. And science has to test the hypothesis and seek to explain what we see in nature with reference to natural law. Science has conclusions that are tentative, pending additional information. To the contrary, my students say, wait a minute, Dr. Forbes, that means that you can tell us how it is until you change your mind? Yeah, because we say that this is the best information, the best explanation we have based upon science. We used to tell you that electrons moved in predictable orbits. Whoops, okay? They don't. It doesn't destroy atomic theory. We used to tell you that the plates on the planet, the continental plates, were static. Whoops, they're not. It doesn't destroy what we know about the planet. What do we try and do? For instance, and even when we have falsifications in science, like Piltdown Man from the right-hand side, Archaeoraptor, who is it that finds these false claims? It's the scientist. It's not the journalists. It's not the attorneys. It's not the philosophers. Science is a self-correcting human endeavor, and it's always based upon our best information at the time. So if we find out that electrons don't move in a predictable order, we don't say, well, you know what, we said that before and we're sticking with it, okay? No, that's not how science operates. So commonly we hear, well, you know what, you're teaching evolution in the classroom, but after all, isn't evolution just a theory itself? The mistake lies there. They're using the colloquial, the vernacular, the everyday usage of the term theory. Let's take a look at what theory is really defined. How do we define theory with reference to the National Academy of Sciences? So in this whole conversation, diction, 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 our choice of words is very important in anything we do in human endeavor, especially in this issue. Do we all mean the same thing by hypothesis? Do we all mean the same thing by theory? Let's take a look at what the National Academy of Sciences says for a couple important definitions that are germane to our discussion in my presentation and your questions afterwards. What's a hypothesis? It's a testable statement about the natural world. It has to be testable, has to be testable, has to be testable. Can we test the hypothesis that salmon prefer cold waters and avoid warm waters? Sure, that's testable. That falls inside the realm of science. What's a scientific fact? A scientific fact, according to the National Academy, is an observation that has been repeatedly confirmed. For instance, the number of ribs in a human, the fossil record showing the derivation of new forms from pre-existing forms, the fact that humans have 46 chromosomes. These are testable. These are facts. They've been repeatedly observed in the world around us. Okay, well, how does that relate? How does a fact relate? How does a hypothesis relate to a scientific law? A scientific law, we say, is a generalized description about how some aspect of the natural world is going to behave under stated conditions. Folks, if we take distilled water and standard atmospheric pressure and we take it up to 100 degrees Celsius, what's it going to do? Boil. Some of the time or all the time? All the time. That's the law. If we take it down to 0, what's it going to do? It's going to freeze. Some of the time or all the time? All the time, because that's a natural law. Where are we trying to get to with this sequence of definitions? We're trying to get to this one right here, scientific theory. A theory in science is very different than a theory in colloquial usage, vernacular usage. In colloquial vernacular usage, a theory is what? It's a wild guess. You know what? I have a theory that Enron stock's going to go up. You run with that, okay? That's not a scientific theory. That's a guess, isn't it? In science, this is why science exists. Science exists solely for the construction of scientific theory. How come? Because theory is predictive. It's predictive. It allows us to understand what might happen under conditions. For instance, is there any doubt what's going to happen with avian flu? Avian flu, what? Mutated from avians to mammals, from non-human mammals to humans, and we're expecting it to mutate to be transmitted from humans to humans. Is that a surprise based upon evolutionary theory? No, because theory allows us to predict. So when you say, isn't evolution just a theory, those people are using the colloquial usage of the term of a wild guess. Theory is as robust as we get. It's the goal of science. When we establish scientific theory, we're very confident. And you know what? I'll challenge you. I'll say that scientific theory is as good as great science gets. A quote I stole from Craig Nelson from Indiana University. It doesn't get any better. We're more confident in scientific theory than virtually any other theory in science. So no, evolution isn't just a theory. Let's take a look here at what's the difference between evolution and natural selection. I'm going to go a little more robust than Dr. Bergman did with my definition here and take a look at evolution and natural selection very briefly so we can have the conversation that follows. What the heck is evolution? What I tell my teachers when I do my teacher workshops is we say, you know what, a good definition could be as simple as evolution is an inheritable change in a species over time. But that's not a very robust example for a biology course. If you wanted to really get detailed, and this will make no sense to us in here right now, but we say evolution are the successive changes in allele composition and frequency in a population as regulated by mutation, genetic drift, gene flow, and selection pressure. And you say, what? It doesn't make any sense, does it? But for our conversation tonight, evolution represents an inheritable change in a species between generations. That's the outcome of a sequence of events that Darwin and Wallace described as natural selection. It's the process by which nature selects those organisms adapted for their environment at that time. So for our conversation tonight, let's use evolution as the noun, the potential product. Let's use natural selection as the verb, the process that may or may not result in the evolution of new forms. That gives us a springboard to have the conversation. So what's intelligent design? And Dr. Bergman can certainly correct my definition later on, but as it was pointed out by the judge, we need to have definitions to have the conversation. Intelligent design, the basic tenet, is the complexity of the natural world is evidence of the planning of a higher intelligence. If science has not yet explained it, therefore, ergo, it must be a higher intelligence, because science certainly can't explain everything. So advocates of intelligent design, which is not new, it's been around for a very long time, say therefore it has to be a higher intelligence. They continue to go on to say that some complex structures that we see in nature have not yet been explained, and therefore there's a higher intelligence or a designer. Well, that's important, because here's what we're seeing happening. How do we as humans deal with gaps in our knowledge? There are a variety of different ways that we can deal with gaps in our knowledge. Here's a test for you. Teacher, I have to give you a test. You ready? Okay. What has 4 legs, wags its tail, buries bones, and barks? You with me? Okay. Is it option A? Is it a cat? What do you think? No, it's not option A. So is it option B, a bird? No. Well, if it's not A and it's not B, see, this is an easy test. I wanted you to feel good after tonight. It's option what? Class? It's option C, obviously. It's a fish. Sucked you into it, didn't I? Okay? Because you thought, well, it has to be the remaining option. Well, couldn't it have been option D, a dog? Could it, in fact, have been option D, another alternative? None of the above? What did you do? You assumed if you didn't know the answer from those first options, it had to be the remaining one. In philosophy and logic, this is called fallacy of false alternatives. And this is one of the basic tenets of intelligent design. If science can't explain it, therefore, ergo, what? It has to be a divine intelligence or some other unexplained phenomenon. No, that's not necessarily the case. We also, we see in logic, we create what's called God of the gaps. If science can't explain lightning, the seasons, earthquakes, what did we do in the past? We inserted a deity. We had a god of seasons, we had a god of the rainbow, we had a god of the earthquakes. That's a dangerous, dangerous theology. Because once science can explain those, what happens to the length of the line at the God Unemployment Office? It's a dangerous theology. It's inserting a God where there's a gap in our scientific knowledge. We have to understand that unexplained doesn't mean inexplicable. Just because we can't explain it today doesn't mean we won't be able to in the future. So is it okay just to say that we don't know at this time? Science is quite capable to do that. So what's the intelligent design position? Once again, if science can't explain it, therefore, it has to be a higher intelligence. Really? We couldn't explain rainbows at one time. We couldn't explain seasons. Doesn't mean that there was a deity involved at all. So does idea qualify as science? Because we haven't addressed that issue yet tonight. Let's find out. Science, remember we said, is guided by natural law. Intelligent design or religion is guided by what? Supernatural intervention. And that's okay. It's just a different way of looking at the world. Science isn't saying that wrong. We're just saying it's a different way of looking at the world. Science explains what is observed with reference to natural law. What does intelligent design do? It explains what's observed with reference to supernatural intervention, the antithesis of science. Science is testable against the empirical world. Intelligent design is rarely testable. Commonly what we see, to quote Francis Bacon, the father of modern science, my paraphrase, he said that science precedes books and not books science. Intelligent design advocates would say, let's teach intelligent design, we'll worry about the evidence later. No. You must earn your place in the science textbooks first. Give us some testable hypotheses if you want to be in the science classroom. In science, conclusions are tentative, right? Pending additional information. In ID, conclusions are final. This is the statement. This is the way it will remain. Science has to be testable, 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 and therefore it's potentially falsifiable. Intelligent design is rarely testable and therefore not potentially falsifiable. Here's the important one. Science asks a question and seeks to find the answer. What happens in intelligent design? They provide the answer and seek to find evidence. A very different approach to looking at our world. So are there competing scientific theories of evolution? Well, what's the answer? No. And the key there, are there scientific alternatives? Are there theological? Certainly, and that's a healthy thing in our society. Are there philosophical alternatives? Certainly. Are there contrasting or competing scientific theories? No. Is there a scientific debate about the validity of evolutionary theory? I would contest and say, no, there isn't. Is there discussion about the details of natural selection? Oh, you betcha, that's what we do. I'm a research biologist, is what I work on. And so you betcha, that's what keeps me employed, is what gets me grants, is that studying the process. There's no discussion on the event, the end product, evolution. We know it's occurred. Are we working out the details of how we got there? Absolutely. So why not teach both sides and let the students decide? We hear this a lot. Well, because there isn't another scientific side. There's another theological side, there's a philosophical side, and do that across campus in the Survey of Religions course. But there isn't an alternative scientific side. Because offering false alternatives to our students would be an academically and intellectually inappropriate and a deceptive disservice to critical thinking. We're saying that you're choosing between two scientific alternatives, and no, that's not what we're doing. So should we let our students choose between all the alternatives? Astronomy and astrology, maybe we should do both those. Chemistry and alchemy, should we also do geography and flat Earth? Should we do psychology and phrenology? Should we do heliocentrism and geocentrums? We get the idea. We can continue through here and say, well, let's do both sides of everything. Why does the both sides issue only come up when we get into evolution? We know why, because it rocks people's worldview. So does ID offer any testable evidence, or is it just a critique of evolution? It's a critique of evolution. Give us some testable evidence. In conclusion, what do the federal courts think about intelligent design? Have they been here? Yes. The important decision, as we know, in December 2005, Judge E. Jones, appointed by George W. Bush, said, let's take a look at this decision. Is, in fact, intelligent design science? The court said, the secular, in case you haven't read the 138-page summary yourself, here's the Reader's Digest version. The secular purposes claimed by the Board of Education amount to a pretext for the board's real purpose, which was to promote religion in the public science classroom. ID violates, here we go, ID violates the centuries-old ground rules of science by invoking and permitting supernatural causation, and that ID's attacks on evolutionary science have been refuted by the scientific community. He goes on to say, we've addressed, and this is the most important of the 138-9 pages, we've addressed the seminal questions of whether ID is science. We have concluded that it is not, and that moreover, ID cannot uncouple itself from its creationist and thus religious antecedents. Although the proponents of intelligent design occasionally suggest that a designer could be involved, there is no separation from the deity. So ID is noted as grounded in theology, not science. So what does it all mean? What's the take-home message here? The take-home message is, has intelligent design earned its place in the science classroom? Does it provide testable hypotheses, or is it merely a critique of evolutionary theory? And the answer to that is, no, it has not, because it's a theological, philosophical alternative. Give us testable hypotheses, earn that place in the classroom, because as Bacon once said, and I paraphrase for you already, is that science precedes the books, not book science. We don't put the books in front of the ID cart. Earn that place in the science classroom. I want to conclude, since I've been told I have a minute here. Michael Behe here is commonly professed as being one of the hallmarks of the intelligent design movement. He's commonly put up there as, here's an academician at a major university who supports intelligent design. If you go to the Leahy University website, you can read this for yourself, and it says, it is our collective position in the Department of Biology that intelligent design has no basis in science, has not been tested experimentally, and should not be considered as science. And so a pretty overwhelming indictment there. So what's the take-home message? The take-home message is, we welcome alternative theories to evolution if, in fact, there are scientific theories and they offer testable hypotheses. Otherwise, earn that place in the science classroom. Is it important to teach theology and philosophy? Absolutely. One of the first courses I signed my daughter up for in college. It's an important part of our human existence, but it's not science, and that's okay. But science has ground rules by which we investigate the natural world, and intelligent design does not qualify. Thank you.
Well, folks, this is where the judge... I want you to think about what you've heard here in these two marvelous presentations. And then I want to read to you Michigan's Constitution, and that's how these things get in front of people like me. And let's just assume for a minute that the Paw Board of Education has adopted a new standard and requirement that all biology courses require the teaching of the Darwinist theory and intelligent design. And someone brings an action in this court and asks me to order them not to do so. Let me read you the Michigan Constitution, and keep in mind the arguments you've heard tonight, and then pose to yourself the question, how would we deal with this? In Article 1, Section 4 of the Michigan Constitution, entitled Freedom of Worship and Religious Belief, Appropriations. Every person shall be at liberty to worship God according to the dictates of his own conscience. No person shall be compelled to attend, or against his consent, to contribute to the erection or support of any place of religious worship, or to pay tithes, taxes, and other rates for the support of any minister of the gospel or teacher of religion. No money shall be appropriated or drawn from the treasury for the benefit of any religious sect or society, theological or religious seminary, nor shall property belonging to the state be appropriated for any such purpose. The civil and political rights, privileges, and capacities of no person shall be diminished or enlarged on account of his religious belief. That's how these things come before the courts. And the position is that the teaching of intelligent design violates that amendment to the Michigan Constitution and as well the federal Constitution. I want to leave you with that thought and one other thing. What if schools were required to teach as a mandatory course a social studies class, and they had to present both sides of capital punishment, abortion, and evolution versus intelligent design? I'll just leave you with that because at the end of this part of the program we're going to have opportunities for questions, and I defer to Mr. Stein.
Sorry, I your podium.
Well, first, I'd really like to thank both participants for coming a long distance. Dr. Forbes from Grand Rapids, Dr. Bergman much farther. This is the first time we've actually had somebody participate from another state, and we greatly appreciate your coming that far. And we also thank the judge for the use of this very beautiful courtroom. And I don't know how many of you have been in a variety of courtrooms, but as technology moves forward and old buildings are torn down, they just don't make them as beautiful as this. So I think it's really a very exceptional evening. At this point, other than announcing that next week there's another program in Kalamazoo at the Public Library at 7 p.m., we'd like to go to question and answer. And feel free to ask questions of either participant or of the judge. Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, I don't remember both of the names of the two.
Dr. Forbes, Dr. Bergman.
Thank you. Dr. Forbes, you were mentioning as one of the standards that intelligent design needed to live up to was that it submit testable claims, and that it should be, as a science, it should be something that can be tested, because if you can't test something, you can't confirm or refute it. And that's what makes science reliable and dependable. Evolution, however, the theory, does not deal primarily or mostly with what's happening right now and in the future. It deals primarily with untestable claims about the past that are not observable, can't be proven, such as very sophisticated life forming by chance spontaneously from unliving chemicals, dinosaurs living long before men, men evolving from ape-like ancestors 2 or 3 million years ago. All of these things were not observed, cannot be tested, cannot be confirmed or refuted. And yet, this is a double standard. You're not requiring evolutionists. They're saying, even though we can't see it, well, the question is, if they cannot see this or prove this and still believe this, would you not say this is what we commonly define as faith? It sounds like evolution is religion.
Okay. Well, then, so if I can ask you then, so are you comfortable then saying that in order to be confident in something, we need to see it happen? Is that the pretense of your, or I don't want your words in your mouth. Is that basically what you're asking me? We haven't seen it. Nobody's seen evolution, therefore how do we know what happened?
I'm saying that's the standard that's been given for something to be considered in the realm of science. And I'm saying that's a double standard right here.
Oh, no, it's not. Because, look, we're in this courtroom here, and look what happens in this courtroom or one of the other rooms in the building here. I'm not sure which room this would happen in. But, I mean, don't we decide literally life and death issues on forensic evidence? Nobody was there to see the crime, but the evidence leads reasonable people to have no other conclusion, to the point where we're willing to put people to death for those things, aren't we, for forensic evidence? So need we really see it to know what happened? I come back, and I don't mean this irrespectfully, sir, but do you remember your conception? But aren't you evidence of your conception? Nobody saw the sperm fuse with the egg, but I'm confident that your presence here is in fact evidence of your conception. It's a forensic evidence. We can look back, and we don't have to see it happen to understand that it happened. And if you say, well, you do, then we're okay with that also, because we see evolution in contemporary times all the time. Why is the U.S. government spending all the money now to study avian flu transmission, to study mad cow disease? Because evolutionary theory suggests what's going to happen, because we've seen it happen in the past. And we look at explanations in the fossil record, for instance, from, as I described here, an empirical place. We say we need to find natural causations. We can say a deity did it, and that's fine, but not from a scientific perspective. So science has to say, how do we account for the fossil record here looking at natural law? And evolution is the only answer to that. So you say, well, did somebody see it? But once again, we don't have to see everything to understand how it happens. In fact, in science, we have to be careful that our observations are correct. I think most of America would probably suggest that the sun rises every day. Does it? Doesn't move, does it? So what we do in science is understand how our observations can be made and how we can make observations empirically. Do we have to see, in fact, whales evolved from four-legged ancestors, tetrapod ancestors? Can we still test the hypothesis? People say, you know what, and I don't want to take time and give a lecture here, because I want to, in case Dr. Bergman has a question. We say, well, our hypothesis is that whales evolved from tetrapod, four-legged ancestors. Say, well, nobody is there to see it. It's still testable in the fossil record. We just go back to older and older fossils, and if the hypothesis is true, what should we find in older and older whale specimens? More elongated tetrapod appendages, and that's exactly what we find. So would that be a good scientific explanation to that? Absolutely. Would it be maybe an acceptable theological explanation? No, but then again, I'm not doing theology. I'm doing science. So you don't have to be there to see it happen. The conception, and I didn't mean to be flippant, that wasn't my intent in that response, but I think if you look at that and think of forensic evidence, we willfully put people to death for forensic evidence based upon, no person can conclude otherwise based upon the evidence.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to that briefly if I could. I think I know what you're driving at. What he's talked about is empirical science, which I think we really need to distinguish between empirical science and historical science. Evolution, given my definition, is a historical science. We try to extrapolate from information we find out from the past. But creationism and intelligent design are likewise historical sciences. When I look at the fossil record, and I spend a lot of time looking at the fossil record, I clearly see evidence of intelligent design. I don't see any evidence at all. And I've looked at the whale fossil record very carefully. And that, to me, is really pathetic. Simply don't have the evidence. What I look at when I look at the evidence is intelligent design. Now, as he correctly brought out, that's an extrapolation from the data. I'm concluding that from what I see. What I see is, of course, the fossils. We both see the same thing. He extrapolates from that something different from what I do. And what I'm saying is we both should admit what he is doing is extrapolating, what I'm doing is extrapolating. We come to different conclusions, and that's really based pretty heavily upon our philosophical assumptions. So I think your point is well taken, and we need to distinguish clearly between historical science and empirical science.
I thought it was an excellent point you brought up, that it was science should be logical. You don't have to see something to be able to infer that it happened. That being the case, I think it's important when we look, it is possible that a naturalistic law explanation could be illogical in some circumstances, and the definition you give of science would then be simply censoring or biased against it. If we looked at your laptop computer, I never saw anyone make it. I see it's very sophisticated. It's got hard drives, it's got an operating system, it's got RAM, it's got all kinds of circuits. If I said, explain how this came to come into being, this sophisticated technological marvel, and someone said, well, given enough time and natural elements and wind and electricity, it just formed by itself. It took a vast amount of time, but eventually it just formed and it operates like it does. You would say that would be scientific by your definition, because it invokes only natural law, but it would not be logical. Some things are so sophisticated, not complex. We know complex things like a snowflake or crystal can form by mindless attraction or magnetic fields, but some things like operating systems and design components of things. Yeah, question. Is it possible that something that science accepts is illogical? Shouldn't science be logical? Shouldn't it be more important that science is logical than that it meets a definition of being guided by natural law?
Certainly. And I don't think we disagree on that point. So what we're trying to do in science, of course, is once again, as you correctly understood, is that we're guided by natural law. Does science have all of the answers? I clearly said, well, of course we don't. Of course we don't. Let me give you a quick example, which many of you have heard me use before, is that if we take, for instance, Moby Dick, and I give you the Moby Dick novel, and we tear out every even-numbered chapter, right? So we yank out chapter number 2, we yank out chapter number 4. And then I say, read Moby Dick for the first time. Reading just every other chapter, don't you get the idea that it's about a really angry whale and some really stupid sailors, and the whale wins and people die? Yeah, we get the idea. Now, do you miss the nuances of the character development? Certainly, but don't we get the story? Are all of the fossils, which is commonly cited, there? Of course not. They'll never be there. The fossil record is Moby Dick with every other chapter missing, but it's enough for us to understand the story. And as you were saying, the difference between, I wouldn't say empirical science versus historical, I'd say experimental science versus historical, because what we do in science, a lot of people have this idea that it always involves bubbling beakers, people in white lab coats, clipboards, and a lab. The reality is science is nothing more than testing hypothesis. Whether we do that through controlled experiments or whether we do that by looking at historical data, the outcome is the same. They're two different approaches going towards the same goal. So we do that logically. I would say absolutely we do that logically. You may believe that it's an illogical conclusion, but we base the conclusions based upon the best current data. And as many people know who read science, it's very common, what's the last paragraph in most scientific articles? Our conclusions raise new questions to which we currently don't have answers. Because you know what? Science will never be done. And that's good for two reasons. Keeps me getting grants, and also the fact that doesn't it just beg new questions? Because we're never going to know it all. So if people say, will you always have all the answers? That's a fallacy in logic called infinite regression. If we find fossil 1 and fossil 10, somebody might ask for fossil 5. Okay, we have 1, 5, and 10. Well, you found 1 and you found 5, find 3. We found 3. Well, where's 2? We don't have 2. Aha. It's an infinite regression. Will science ever have all the answers? No, that's what's so great about science, because there are always new questions. If you find that illogical, we don't think it is. It's an empirical approach to our world.
My issue hasn't necessarily been with the intelligent design, but with the fact that there is no, there doesn't seem to be any use of things that don't fit the model. You talk at testability and falsibility and all that other sort of stuff, but unless you bring in and allow the people who are in the classroom to know that there are things out there that don't fit the model. Carbon dating is used when it fits the model, but it's ignored when it doesn't. The amount of nickel in the ocean was once thought should be greater than it was if this was a long age Earth, and if nickel was deposited at the rate it was being deposited today, or whatever. These things don't fit. The strata sometimes don't fit. When things don't fit, rate of decay of plutonium, who knows how much was there to start with? We don't. But when those things don't fit the model, and you don't teach it, then if the flood can account for, or theoretically account for, layers of strata, things found where they shouldn't be, stuff like that, then why throw that out and not let my kids who are taught at home and in the church that this is a valid possibility, and the teacher says can't be, just plain can't be, when that's not true. You're always investigating to find out how the electrons weren't running in a true pattern. Great. When they find that they find new stuff, it's fine if it's found by the scientists, but boy, it better not be even thought of in the Bible. And I just don't think it's right. Yeah, the question is, why not teach the stuff that doesn't fit? the model.
I think the question, and I think you answered your own question, is that, as you said, well, my kids learn this alternative in church, which is where the non-scientific alternative should be explored, can be explored. The question of tonight is that should non-scientific information be presented in the science classroom? And as the judge read to us, no, they can't. As I shared with you in the Dover decision, it violates our First Amendment clause. Now you say, well, okay, let's get past the legal aspect, but isn't it just logical to show the other side? Let me state this, is that, as I already said in response to the last question, science is full of holes. In fact, this is how we encourage people to go on to graduate school. We go, you know what? We don't have the answer to this. You could find the answer. In fact, we require in the sciences our people at the master's and certainly the PhD level to investigate a question to which there is no answer. We don't give PhDs otherwise. You have to find the holes in the data. And so those are there. So if there are scientific alternatives, and there are tons of them, there are tons of scientific questions that we don't know the answer to, that's what we do investigate, and that's what we encourage. Because a lot of times people say, you know what? Everybody in the sciences, you want to support, a Darwinian view of life, and nobody's going to go against what Darwin says. Anybody who's in a PhD program tells you careers in science are not made by jumping on the bandwagon. Careers in science are made by toppling the apple cart. Many of you know about the names maybe Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldridge, who in '72 came up with something called punctuate equilibrium that was completely contrary to classic Darwinian gradual natural selection. We didn't sequester them and put them in a closet. It made their careers. We got, wow, we've never looked at it that way before. That's how careers are made in science, not by going along. If you finish your PhD and go, I just want to tell you that after 8 years of research, I've confirmed what they said. You're going nowhere fast in science. Science is made, in fact, by finding those holes, sir. If there are theological responses to the holes in the science, sure, do that in theology, do that in philosophy. We're just saying that it doesn't have its job in the science classroom, because you know what? My college president won't let me teach pre-Columbian history. You know why? I don't know anything about pre-Columbian history. Do you want me teaching your theology, sir?
One clarification for a number of people here. Dr. Forbes mentioned not teaching non-science in a science classroom. That's more of a policy issue for the university. The legal issue is ID religion. Now, the First Amendment prohibits the state or the public schools from teaching religion. So the question becomes, is this religion under a different name? That's basically the issue, the legal issue. And if it is religion, then it can't be taught in public schools. It can certainly be taught in the home or in church or anywhere else, and it should be taught, but not in public schools. And the reason why the title uses the term public schools, it can be taught in private schools. That's not an issue. Okay? The real legal issue is, can ID be taught in public schools? And the question is, because is it religion? If it's religion, it cannot be.
Yeah, let me respond to that. This is an area I've been focusing on quite a bit, and we mentioned Behe. What I found is when you come out of the closet opposing Darwinism, it's basically the end of your career. And that's what happened to Behe. He was a well-respected scientist, published widely in the literature, had graduate students, had grants. Since he came out with his book, Darwin's Black Box, students, graduate students were taken away, grants were taken away. He basically does nothing at that school except teach his classes, go to committee meetings, and goes home. They've pretty much taken his career away. And over, I've seen this happen. And this is why the new crop of ID people, they're staying in the closet. They are not going to let it out what their beliefs are, because they know full well if they come out of the closet, that's likely to be the end of their career. My own case, I've been denied tenure 3 times, openly, because they accused me. Okay, they were suspicious that I might have, and this is what they said, I might have talked about religion in the classroom. That's ironic, because when I was let go from Bowling Green State University, I was an atheist. But they didn't believe that. They said, yeah, you're just trying to cover up the fact that you were teaching religion, and therefore you're trying to claim you're an atheist so that you can get out of this charge. And they admitted they had no evidence I was teaching religion. But they said that you might have. And if indeed you were, then you should be fired. I find over and over careers are ruined because of this issue. And I find it ironic, as I brought out in my talk, why is it okay to teach against intelligent design? Isn't that religion? Why is it okay to teach one side but not the other side? What's wrong with teaching one side if you can teach the other side? Again, my textbooks, they specifically teach against intelligent design. And they say, like this textbook does, they say the idea of irreducible complexity has been falsified. It's not true. Simply not true. That's ludicrous. And this is, I see, where we're at now. And what I see is happening over and over again is the religiously oriented students are leaving the public schools en masse. And what I see is this country is going to be divided in half over issues like this, because there's simply no tolerance for one side. And the other side is fully tolerated. And as a result, I don't want to see this, but I see we're going to have a blue country and a red country. It's going to be divided right down the middle, and I see these two sides more and more antagonistic against each other over issues like this and over decisions like the Dover decision, which I thought was absolutely appalling. That judge made so many mistakes in there, like there are no Darwin skeptics. I came up with 3,000. According to him, there are hardly any, but there are many.
With regard to the Dover decision, I think it's a very interesting decision. And again, for what it's worth, not really taking the side of doing it, because I don't think most people read it. It is, as Dr. Forbes said, 139 pages. It's very thorough. Jones was a Republican, an open Republican before he was appointed by President Bush, and not really considered an activist judge. And wrote this 139-page opinion. If you want it, it's online. Later, I can give you the name of it, and it's easy to find if you wish to read it. I think it's very enlightening. I mean, you may disagree with it and all, but you look at the issues in the way that they need to be looked at. Jim?
I'll try to make a pretty real fast question. First, I want to say, you asked a question about sociology class, and I would believe that these are questions that would be good in a sociology class, as posed as an issue as to how society responds to these types of issues. So with that comment, I'd like to ask if you could maybe elaborate on what irreducible complexity is, number one. Number two, what the heck is with the flagellum, this bacteria? And finally, what is the wedge strategy anyway?
Okay, irreducible complexity is the idea that, well, from my discussion, that for everything to work except what they call fundamental particles, which are quarks and leptons, like electrons, electrons are leptons. So for everything to work, you must have two or more parts for that to work. If you take one part away, the system no longer works. For a human being, for example, you can take your hands away and you can still function as a human. Less effectively, but still function. Certain structures, if you take away, like your heart and your brain and your hypothalamus and your pituitary and so on, you cannot function. You're going to die. You cannot live. So irreducible complexity simply says that in order for things to function, you must have certain parts. And there are parts beyond that, like a chair. You can have frills on the chair and it still functions. But you must have, for these chairs, you must have 4 legs. You take one leg away and it doesn't function as a chair anymore. Okay, or at least very well. The bacterial flagellum is a structure which is enormously complex. Okay, it's found in what we used to think were the simplest organisms known, and that's bacteria. And Darwinists taught for many, many years that all life basically evolved from bacteria, and bacteria were thought to be enormously simple. As we do more and more work on bacteria, we're realizing that they are enormously complex. And there's this structure inside the bacteria, which is the flagellum, and if you look at it, it looks like a motor. It has a rotor, it has a stator, it has bearings, it has a source of energy, it has a U-junction, it has all these parts that you see in a motor. And the problem is this will not work unless you have a certain minimum number of parts. Okay? And the idea behind the bacterial flagellum is that this cannot evolve because it is useless until all the parts are there. Like your body is useless until you have those certain minimum number of parts. If you don't have those minimum number of parts, you're not going to live. You're not going to be alive. Okay? And so what he's arguing from this is that the bacterial flagellum could not have evolved. And looking at the 136-page decision, they discussed that. And I was appalled at the judge's decision on that. What he's trying to say is that there's simply no evidence that this evolved. Now, correctly, he's not saying that that therefore proves a designer made it. What he's saying is that is evidence that this was designed. Fine, keep looking for evidence that this evolved because Michael Behe is an evolutionist. He believes in evolution. He believes in common ancestry. He would be called a theistic evolutionist because he's a Catholic. He feels simply that evolution cannot explain everything, and he feels that when they try to explain everything, there are problems. Okay? And his book, ironically, I've read many reviews of it, and no one has really found any major fault with this book. They basically say they disagree. Or they try to look at other structures, such as the secretory systems in certain bacteria, and say, well, the bacterial flagellum evolved from the secretory system. Okay, the third thing is the wedge. In order to do research in the area of intelligent design, you have to have money. Okay? And there's no way you're going to get any money from any state organization to do research that even hints at intelligent design. So the only source they had was, ironically, churches and people who were religiously oriented. But you're not going to get a church to give you thousands of dollars to do research on bacterial flagellum. It's hard to convince a congregation to do that. They're going to say, well, why should we give our money to you to do research on the bacterial flagellum? What does it have to do with anything that we're interested in? I mean, why don't you go to the state and get grants to do that? Well, in order to get money, they developed this wedge document which basically said that if you give us money to do research on the bacterial flagellum, we can then work toward helping science be less antagonistic toward a theological explanation and help science be more receptive to possible theological explanation or possible, at least a designer explanation to help us understand what's going on. So it's basically a fundraising doctrine, or a fundraising document, and I get letters from the ACLU. They're fundraising. I'm sure you would not say those things in those letters. I know they were prepared by somebody whose job is to make fundraising letters. And therefore, when I get these letters that sometimes I really get upset about, I don't blame it on you because I know you didn't write it. You probably had some PR agency write it. Well, the wedge doctrine was the same thing. They had PR agencies work with them on this document, which they use in order to raise money. Now, on the other hand, a lot of ID people do not agree with the wedge document at all. It was simply a document they used to help raise money. I don't particularly agree with the wedge document. In the ID movement, there are a fair number of atheists, agnostics, Jews, Catholics, a lot of Muslims, ironically. In fact, the majority seem to be Catholics, Roman Catholics. Behe himself is a Roman Catholic. And a lot of these people disagree with the wedge document, but that's irrelevant. They're still part of intelligent design, and they're still interested in what this has to offer for us. Let me just briefly give one example of how ID is useful. And I can give many, many examples. I had back problems, really bad back problems. I had shots, I had Vioxx, I had Bextra. They wanted to do surgery. The doctor said, the reason you're having back problems is because you evolved from a four-legged primate, and therefore you have back problems because you weren't designed to walk upright. And therefore there's not much we can do except surgery, plenty of bed rest, and pain relievers. That was orthodox medicine 20 years ago. So finally I went to a creationist doctor. Thought, well, maybe he had something to say. He said that what you're doing is all wrong. The back is designed to walk upright. You need to use the back how God designed it. This is what he said to me. You need to, it sounded to me crazy. He said you need to, sleep is the worst thing. You need to walk, you need to exercise, get off all that pain-relieving stuff. Don't have surgery, okay? And he looked at my x-rays, so he was able to evaluate my CT and my MRI and my $6,000 worth of scans that I had taken. He said, we'll put you on an exercise program, walks 20 minutes a day, etc. And now I had these problems for about 10 years. I had tens of machines, I had all kinds of stuff to deal with this problem, which got worse and worse. Very skeptically, I thought, well, what I'm doing is not helping. The next step is surgery. I'll try this. If it doesn't work, I'll have surgery. So I exercised, I walked. When I was having back problems, I didn't lay down as I did before, but I used the back, and ironically didn't happen right away, but within 6 months, I had hardly any pain. In a year, my back was better than it was when I was 25. And now, ashamed to say, I abuse it. I lift things I shouldn't, etc. I don't lift properly. I don't use my legs. I use my back, and my back is perfect. I don't take any medication for it. Haven't had surgery. Haven't been to a doctor in a while. This is one of many examples which we've documented where, in this case, creationism welded the answer, whereas evolution misled us. And recently I was talking to a professor at University of Michigan, and he says, yep, what you are saying now, this is the standard treatment at University of Michigan. Exercise, laying down, we don't recommend that anymore. Get off the pain medication, use it, strengthen it, the whole system works together. If you use it properly, you won't have any back problems. So he said, I agree with that, and he happened to be a creationist as well, but he told me that later. But he said that has nothing to do with our policy at U of M. We do it because we found scientifically it works. So in this case, the prediction by creationists have been proven to be correct. The prediction by evolutionists have been proven to be clearly wrong. And I could give you 10 other examples of the same thing where the predictions of creationism have proved to be correct. So I agree, we need to test these hypotheses. And this was tested N of 1 in my case, but now we've tested with many other people, and now that is the orthodox treatment that I went through to treat back problems. So I think not exposing students to this possibility may interfere with their scientific research in the future.
I'll get to your question in a second. Let me leave, because I know all of you are interested in this subject of evolution, creationism, and so on. So there's a book I read a while ago. I'll read it to you if you're interested. It was written by Francis Collins. Maybe one of the professors know the name of it. This was the gentleman that did the genome sequence for the U.S. government. The first person to sequence all of the genes. As mentioned, there's 23 pairs of chromosomes, and the chromosomes are genes. And genes is what codes for color of hair, eyes, defects, and so on. And the interesting part was Collins was raised in a religious household. In college, became an atheist. Then he became religious again. Of some Christian sect. I don't remember which one it was. Went to medical school. He first got out as, I think, a physicist, and then went to medical school, and then later was hired to do the genome sequencing. And basically, he writes the book sort of looking at the question, is there God, or which should we follow? And he found, I'll give you the punchline, that there was no inconsistency in believing in evolution and believing in religion. He said many people feel you've got to make a choice between evolution and religion. His conclusion was, for him, he puts forth the evidence why you do not have to decide between them, that they're mutually, you can believe in both. I found it very interesting.
I think the term believe in evolution was really not correct. Another great book is Endless Promotion Most Beautiful by Sean Carroll that talks about looking at DNA and genes that are common to many animals and how those are rearranged. Maybe Dr. Forbes could speak about that and its role in evolution.
I'd like to use as a kind of springboard in your first call. And I think it's, as I said in one of my slides up here, diction. We have to kind of be on the same page so we have the same ground rules for conversation. Is that, and I think what you said here is that you really don't believe in evolution because science is not a faith-based ideology. You either accept the science, you accept the evidence, or you reject it. So we need to separate those two forms of inquiry there. And your other question in your book relates to some of the questions, in fact, that Jim asked before, which I think I'd want to respond briefly, kind of in a roundabout way of responding that you did, is that what we heard the doctor's response on irreducible complexity and whatnot. It's a very big misunderstanding that people have is that evolution is goal-oriented. That evolution is always, natural selection is always working towards a goal, the flagellum, the Claudine cascade, etc. What it fails to take into account is what we call emergent qualities, is that was in fact the vertebrate eye the goal, or were there incipient structures as we talk about? We look at the vertebrate eye and we go, how can natural selection possibly account for that eye? Well, you're assuming that half an eye is of no value, and we commonly hear this from the ID camp, is that, of what value is half an eye? Of what value is a quarter of an eye? Of what value is a third of an eye? Only the entire structure is of value. Really? Let me give you an option. If I gave you an option to whether you could be completely blind or you can see light versus dark, I suspect you would choose light versus dark. Would that confer any survival advantage to you if you were a wild type of organism? A little bit, right? What if I gave you the option to see light versus dark versus shadows versus just light? Would you probably go for shadows? Wouldn't that confer a survival benefit in the environment? Sure. What if I gave you the option to just see shadows or to see detailed black and white silhouettes? Would that confer a survival advantage to you? Might you live long enough to pass on that trait? What if I said, well, how about if you saw color silhouettes? Might that confer an advantage over the black and white silhouettes? How about if I said, as you see it here today, would you like to have the ability to see detailed color images? Yes. You say, well, how did we get there? Because every one of those incipient structures along the way had what we call an evolution in emergent quality. Each one showed a new advantage that the one before it didn't. Therefore what? It was conserved in the gene pool. Natural selection conserves the success stories and gets rid of the mistakes. Wasn't every one of those along the way a success story? Yes. What was the end product? The vertebrate eye. So we look at the bacterial flagellum and say, well, how did we get there? Because halfway there would have been no value. Really? Or is there another way to look at it? You're discounting there the incipient structures and what are called emergent qualities all the way along the way. The other thing that was brought up in the discussions here tonight is the old conspiracy theory, is that we wish we could test those hypotheses if we only had money. Well, of course, you can never refute a conspiracy theory because it's untestable itself, right? Well, nobody will let us test the hypothesis. Therefore, that's why we haven't tested them. The Wedge document came from the Discovery Institute, one of the most highly financed political action groups in the United States. There's money there to test. It may not have to be the bacterial flagellum, but there's plenty of money there. So to say that, well, nobody will let us test it, we don't have the money, step up to the plate and let's do it and get past the conspiracy theory.
Thank you. Question for Dr. Bergman. As I listen to this as a taxpayer, I'm most concerned that children going to school today are being prepared to compete in a global economy. Can you cite an example of another developed nation where ID is taught as part of their science curriculum?
What?
Can you cite an example of another developed industrialized nation where ID is taught as part of its science curriculum?
I could cite many schools that teach, private schools, and ironically, statistically, they're about a grade or two ahead. At my school, we find that those students that attended private schools, where ID is taught, they're an average of a grade or two ahead. So the empirical evidence, I think, is quite clear from what I've looked at, is teaching intelligent design, you have a clear advantage.
In what nation, where our young adults will grow up competing against, where in what country is ID by policy taught in the science classroom?
I'm not aware of any nation where it's taught by policy.
Dr. Bergman, do you agree with Dr. Forbes' definition of what science is? He's spent quite a bit of time with his visuals explaining his definition of science. And considering what he said, do you think that ID, creationism, is science?
Well, I think he's asking whether, given his definition, whether I think ID is science. I think science is often used as name-calling. I spent a fair number of years doing research in the area of cancer. A lot of this stuff that he's talking about, we were concerned with. We got two populations. The difference between the two populations relative to health and sickness, that's basically what we looked at. Okay, and we assumed, and we even sometimes used the word, how is this designed? And you're looking at a structure which, gene, we work with folate receptors, for example. And the question is, how is this designed? Now, we didn't talk about theology or religion, but we often did use the term design. So we assumed it was designed in some intelligent way. And our job was to try to find out in what way that is intelligently designed. And so that's basically what we did. And interestingly, in the years I spent at the medical college, first as a student and then on the faculty, evolution was never brought up. And I was interested in this issue, so if it was brought up, I would have tuned right in. It was never brought up at all in any of my coursework, except they used the term, this gene is evolutionarily conserved. All that means is that this gene is very similar throughout the entire animal kingdom. You brought up that book by that professor from the University of Wisconsin. I forget his name, Sean Carroll, yeah, which I have both of his books and I've read them. What he finds is that genes in humans and very, very, quote, primitive life forms are enormously similar. Nobody expected to see the similarity across the board in all these genes. And I think the reason they're similar is because they have to be similar to work, which we're back to the idea of irreducible complexity. And the best example I can think of is every car I've ever seen has tires that are round. Why do they have tires that are round? Because certain structures work because of what they call functional constraints. Why do we find the genes are enormously similar in all forms of life? You take the genes connected with ATP, for example, adenosine triphosphate. Why are they so similar? Why is ATPase so similar? It's similar because of functional constraints. And to me, this is eloquent support of the intelligent design position. By the way, I like his books very well. I think he does a good job. And I saw just intelligent design written throughout that. The problem is not the facts. The problem is what you walk away from. He walks away from evolution interpretations. I walk away from design interpretations. So the facts are the same. The difference is the interpretation.
Actually, two for Dr. Bergman. And I guess the first one is more or less a yes-no question. A little while ago, you were talking about your back troubles and the way that you ended up treating those. Were you serious in thinking of that story as a way of testing evolutionary versus ID theory?
Well, that to me was a personal test. I think it too often boils down as what is my personal experience? What is one's experience? And it's not only that, there are many other experiences. I could mention vestigial organs. When I was a young child, a doctor said, "Got to have your tonsils out." And I said, "Why?" He says, "Well, it's better to have them out now while you're young than when you're older." Well, why? Well, because less problems. So I took my tonsils out when I was 6 years old. Then they grew back. Then I had them out again. I had to have them out again. And the reason was, he said, they're vestigial. They have no function. And then when I went to graduate school, I learned that they have a very important function and that I am now susceptible to a number of health problems because I had a tonsillectomy. And now for you teach anatomy, you probably come across this as well. Now they are reluctant to do a tonsillectomy unless there's clear medical reasons for it. My wife had a baby by cesarean section. Doctor said after the surgery, he says, "Oh, while you're in there, you took your appendix out." Because it's good to have it out because it's vestigial, it has no function. It just causes a problem. Now we know, and I learned in medical school, that the appendix has a number of very important functions. We don't know all what it does, but these are just another couple of examples where the idea that we have useless structures turned out to be pretty tragic in some cases. And the idea that all structures, have a benefit. In fact, Darwin said he would stake his whole theory on vestigial organs alone. Because why would God make an organism with 180 useless organs, the tonsils, the appendix, the adenoids, the pineal gland, the thyroid gland? Why would he put all these structures in there if there was a creator? He concluded, therefore, this is support for evolution. And this was the first thing I looked at because all I have to do is find a use for it, and I've disproved the evolutionary hypothesis. Now, in my anatomy book, we use whole. I don't know what you use, but you look at vestigial organ, it's not mentioned. Anatomists recognize there are no vestigial organs. My biology book still claims as the tonsils and the appendix and the coccyx and all these organs are vestigial, have no function. They learn this in biology, then they take anatomy and they learn the functions for these. Students raise questions. They wonder, why is there this difference? And I say, well, biologists don't know what they're talking about. Anatomists do.
But you're seeing this as evidence in favor of ID? That was my question.
I see it personally, yes, as evidence in favor of ID. What we're looking at is the data, and we're extrapolating from the data. We both see the same data. There's no disagreement with any of his data. The difference is the interpretation from the data. And that's why I say they're both evolution and creationism are philosophical positions based on the evidence.
I just want to make one quick statement, too. Two, if I can, and is to bring the discussion back where we're supposed to be. We can go through information about evolution and natural selection all night long. These discussions have been held before, but the question here tonight is, does intelligent design qualify as science? This isn't about, is evolutionary science good science? This isn't about, are there holes in evolutionary theory? This is about, does intelligent design qualify as science? I gave you the National Academy of Sciences, the most prestigious scientific body on the planet, hands down, no number two. They said, let's agree that this is the definition of science. It's very congruent with what we saw in the court decision. And then, by those standards, does intelligent design qualify as science? That's the issue on the table, not someone's interpretation or anecdotal stories about experiences. And I'm not saying about you, sir. I'm not trying to relate to it, so please don't take it that way. But really, the issue here tonight is, in fact, does intelligent design count as science? Let's not go down those other roads, okay? Let's stick on course here. And your question, I think, was unanswered, is that does this, in fact, qualify as science based upon National Academy's definition and Judge William Overton's decision?
I don't think Dr. Bergman can answer the question. Talk about a lot of other side issues.
Okay, could I respond?
Can I finish?
Okay, I'm sorry.
And if you agree that his definition of science is what science is, fine. If you don't agree, what part of what he defined science as do you disagree with?
Okay, my response is, if, let's say, intelligent design is not science, okay, then is information against intelligent design. This isn't science either. Pardon?
Agree with his definition?
Yeah, I do, and therefore I think that textbooks should not teach against intelligent design. They should not try to utilize these kind of arguments to say intelligent design is not true. And the main arguments they use is, for example, the idea of poor design. The retina is poorly designed because it's backwards. And therefore this proves there's no creator or there's no intelligent designer. Therefore this proves evolution. I have a problem with that. Either say intelligent design is science or it's not science. If it's not science, then don't lecture against it. Don't teach against it. Keep this out of the books. Just talk about science. A lot of people want to have it both ways. Either if it's science, then let's teach for and against it. If it's not science, then let's don't teach either for it or against it. It's frustrating for me to have to spend time to show them this claim that the human retina is backwards is ludicrous. It's irresponsible. It's just simply not true. There are dozens of reasons why the retina is designed the way it is. And the claims they make are simply not true. For me to have to sit here and show that irreducible complexity is indeed a valid idea, I'm wasting my time. And yet you have to do that when books like this say irreducible complexity has been carefully scientifically refuted. It's not true. And that's simply false. Yes.
Getting back to the central point here about whether or not ID is something that should be taught, my question to both of you, I want to make sure Dr. Forbes has a chance to respond, is, and this gets to choosing words carefully. This is calling something intelligent design presumptive. And if there are two sides, is it really the opposite of intelligent design, poor design, or idiotic design? Because it seems to me like you could make that converse argument. If you say something is designed, you could just as easily argue that it was poorly designed. Aspects of our own bodies that I think we all wonder, if it were designed intelligently, why was it designed that way?
Just responding to this, and I've heard the question phrased in a similar manner, is that, and some evolutionists might say, in fact, the best evidence of natural selection resulting in evolution are not the wonderful designs in nature, it's not the cheetah, it's not the eye, it's all of those ridiculous events that we have in our bodies and we see in nature. It's all the idiotic designs that we see in nature. Why do we see those? If in fact we had an intelligence or an intelligent designer doing everything correctly, why do we have the female reproductive tract with the problems we see? Because a little extra tissue would have solved endometriosis, ectopic pregnancies, and the list goes on. Wouldn't it be nice if our arm moved all the way around, and in fact, so did every other joint? That's maybe not the best design. And we could go on, because that's not the intent here tonight, is we could go through just hours of the goofy designs that we see in nature. From an evolutionary perspective, we might say that that's the best evidence of natural selection, because contrary to what you see on Discovery Channel, the fin, fur, and feather flicks, natural selection does not result in the best designs. They result in those structures that are good enough to allow the organism to live long enough to reproduce. Forget about the Discovery Channels that only the strong survive. That's nonsense. You only have to be strong enough to live long enough to produce viable offspring. And if that makes you a warthog rather than a gazelle, congratulations. Warthogs do just fine. So it's some of the really ridiculous designs in nature that are the best evidence of natural selection.
Yeah, my response is, if it's okay to teach things are poorly designed, dysteleology they call that, and then it's wrong for me to teach things are well designed, we have a problem here. I argue these things are well designed. That's evidence of intelligent design. That's illegal. The judge in Pennsylvania said that's illegal. But yet it's perfectly legal to say things are poorly designed, and that's evidence against an intelligent designer. We're being inconsistent. And talking about the Discovery Institute, could I ask you, what is the ACLU of Michigan's budget? Do you have any idea? Just guess.
Well, it's about $1 million.
Okay, that's more than the Discovery Institute's whole budget. I personally have gotten grants over $1 million. The Discovery Institute's budget for a year is around $1 million. That's a small chunk of change. Pretty hard to do much research these days with $1 million. To build a good lab, you're talking about $40 million to build a good lab. The Discovery Institute, I've heard a lot of horror stories. Like, for example, they can't afford trash pickup, so the employees take the trash home so that the city can collect it. This is the kind of budget they have. They're not flowing in money. They're having a hard time surviving. And I wonder whether or not they're going to survive in the future because of several reasons. So you're not talking about a lot of money. You're talking about pennies compared to the money that evolutionists have to defend their theory. So money is a big issue.
This whole discussion is an origin science discussion that's going on right now. When our kids are in school and they're studying this topic, and when you look at research money being spent, we want to know the truth. What really happened? How did we get here? How did all this stuff get here? In school, in a setting, just assume, if anything is possible, if things really were created supernaturally by a higher intelligence, would science, the way that it's defined right now, be able to discover that?
Is it testable?
So if it was true, science would never be able to try.
Is it testable? No.
Evolution isn't testable.
Well,
Spontaneous reforming from nothing isn't testable. So you're saying if it was true, the way they're teaching right now, if that was the truth, you'd never be able to come to it because of this censored definition of science, that it has to involve natural law, not other explanations that science doesn't know yet.
No, sir. All we're saying is that when we try and explain it scientifically, we're constrained by explanations of natural law. We're not saying, as I said at the beginning, I'm not saying that your deity, somebody else's deity, didn't do it. We're just saying that that's not the realm of science. We give that to the theologians and the philosophers. And I think I made that very clear, that we have three very important forms of human inquiry. It's called traditional epistemologies: science, theology, and religion. They're all valuable forms of human inquiry, but they operate by different rules and different constraints. And from a scientific standpoint, we have to base our descriptions based upon natural law. Science can't say whether there are supernatural events or not, because it's not testable. So it's not an attack. It's not an attack on a theology, because is the concept of God testable? No. So can science address the concept of a God? Absolutely not. It's outside the purview of science. End of discussion.
And I think the other step there is that Dr. Forbes had mentioned before, the question, is it science or not? There's also a third, if it's not science, what is it? It could be philosophy. If so, philosophy can be taught in schools. Is it religion? If it's religion, it cannot. That's the issue, really. Is it religion or not? And by saying something is evolution, or what Dr. Francis Collins said, and which a lot of people believe, there is religion, and maybe that's pre-reading, and there's also evolution that occurred. And we're not saying there's not religion. The problem is that the religious part cannot be taught in schools. And I'd like to just add one other comment. And there's a good reason for that. There's a number of different religions. Which one would you teach? In other words, some people want to put up the Ten Commandments. I ask them, which version? Some people don't even know there's different versions. And there are. There's a Christian version, there's a Judaic version. And many different religions. And they'll look at this differently. The question then becomes, which religion? And obviously we know it's impossible to pick one or the other. Everybody believes the religion that they belong to. And that's why our forefathers in the First Amendment were very smart in saying there should be no establishment of religion, meaning religion belongs outside the public schools. You teach it at home, teach it in your car, teach it to your children, in your churches, and wherever, but not in the public sector, because they didn't know nobody's ever denied basically religion. Yes, sir.
Me? I was just wondering if you could explain Moby Dick, the book that you took every other page out of by natural.
Sorry, I missed that.
If you could explain Moby Dick by natural processes, in other words, scientifically, could you explain the book Moby Dick, or is that not explainable?
I guess I don't understand the question. I don't understand your question.
The fact is that Moby Dick was printed, the type was set, and the book was manufactured. And I was just wondering what natural, and that's a scientific explanation. This is the facts, and this is what happened, and here's the book. And you're telling me that if you've got something that's got complexity, as Dr. Bergman said, and he said that with what we know, maybe the 120 million rods and cones can't all connect. And you start getting into numbers, and those numbers get to where if these events were going on at tremendous rates, it would never happen.
So science can't explain it.
Repeat the
Therefore,
question.
we get into the fallacy of false alternatives again.
Could you repeat his question?
I believe it, and please restate if I'm misinterpreting it, but go ahead.
I just want to hear your natural explanation for Moby Dick, the book that you were tearing every other page out of.
Yeah. Maybe every other page would be too brutal. But
well, I don't care if you didn't take any before you tore the pages out. I don't care.
Let me see. I'm not intentionally trying to step around your question, but I'm still not sure that I understand it. Let me see if this addresses it. Is that Dr. Bergman was saying that the probabilities, if you will, of this event occurring are astronomical. Well, let's assume that that's the case. Could science explain every single step? I told you no. Science has a lot of the pieces of the puzzle missing. But if you then default and say, therefore, ergo, we must insert a deity or a divine power or an intelligence, that gets us back to that error in logic we call a God of the gaps or the fallacy of false alternatives. If science has not yet explained it, therefore, ergo, there was an intelligence. It could be, sir. That could be. But that's not how science doesn't have the luxury of saying it's a supernatural influence. Science says we don't have the answer to that part of the puzzle yet. But we'll get back to you. Because, as I said in my presentation, we couldn't explain rainbows at one point. We couldn't explain earthquakes. And so what did we do? We inserted a deity. We now can explain those. So do we have gaps in our knowledge? Will we always have gaps? Sure. And once again, our discussion here tonight gets beyond the details of evolution. That's not why we're here tonight. And we can have these conversations later because your questions are common and they're easily addressable. But I think we have to once again turn back and say, do your concerns fall within the realm of science, or they fall in religion? And I will say right away, never get your legal advice from a biologist. But I'll ask the attorneys here. My interpretation of the Establishment Clause is not that we can't teach about religion. We can't establish religion. So we can teach about religion. We can talk about what do we do in classes. We talk about survey of religions. We just can't advocate for a particular position. Is that about from a biologist's view? Okay. So sure, we can teach about religion. We just can't advocate for a particular religion. And my suggestion is that that's exactly what would happen if we introduced intelligent design, and that was the position of the Jones decision in the Dover case.
If we cannot, at this time, fully explain evolution, then shouldn't we take it out of the textbooks in the same way we need to take, or you say we should take, intelligent design out of the textbooks until we can explain it with the same degree of accuracy we can explain a rainbow?
Okay, the question, if you didn't hear it back in the cheap seats, was if we don't have all of the explanations in science, shouldn't we take it out of the textbook? Then can I ask you what topic in science should remain in the textbook? What topic in science do we have the entire, every page of Moby Dick for?
Okay, so where do we start?
Okay,
do we start with middle school? Do we start with high school? Do we start with college? Where do we start with evolution? At what point do we think people are ready for a non-complete answer when they're first learning about the testable natural world? Doesn't belong in first grade. Doesn't belong in middle school.
Sir, might I ask you to give me any form of human inquiry, be it science, be it philosophy, be it sociology, where we have the complete explanation of anything. What's your field? Can you pick something from your field?
In lower school, education. We can teach algebra, we can teach arithmetic. All right, 2 and 2 makes 4 every time. We can focus on reading, phonics. We can focus on a lot of science that can be explained every time. Why are we dealing with the unexplainable evolution at that lower level when we could wait and not even deal with the origin of man, deal with rainbows, deal with biology, and then wait till they go to college? Then they can learn about origins of man and where they come from.
Well, the reason for that is, are you through? I'm not trying to cut you off. Okay. There was a question earlier, I forget, from the gallery up here. I think it was from the gentleman in the red up here. Is that how are we going to compete in a global environment if our students aren't introduced to the most accurate scholarship? Who determines what's taught in the classroom? Researchers and those invested in that scholarship. I don't tell my son's pre-Columbian art history teacher how to teach pre-Columbian art history because I can't determine that scholarship. It's not my field of expertise. What we teach in the classroom is determined by the scholars in that field. And in biology, evolution is to be considered by those scholars, although you'll say that there's a contrasting cap, and I appreciate and understand that. But it's determined that this is the only scientific explanation of life on Earth. Do we have all of the answers? Well, no, we don't. But here's why we want to do it. Because when in my teachers' workshops, I always tell my teachers, the K-12 teachers say, this is going to come as a shock to you, but probably less than 0.5% of your students will ever become scientists. Because we all in our minds want to believe that all of our students are going to become scientists. But won't they all become consumers of science? Absolutely. We're entering the most technologically, scientifically based society that civilization has ever seen. A gee whiz fact, use any number you want. We always say that anytime you hear 90% of everything is made up. But if you go back to the dawn of science, count every scientist who's ever been alive today, I think the two of us will probably agree that, 80, 90% of those are alive today? It's the most scientifically based society we will probably ever see. So we need to prepare our students with the best scholarship available, scientific scholarship, right? You can do the best theology, you can do the best philosophy, and prepare them to function as consumers of science. Evolutionary biology is not only the best scientific theory we have seen in the field of science, but it's also the best vehicle by which to teach the nature of science. What is the process of science? We determine what's called robustness of scientific theory based upon corroborating evidence from other fields. Virtually every field of science provides corroborating evidence for scientific theory. We are more sure about scientific theory than we are about the fact that the Earth revolves around the sun. That's in question? Of course that's not in question. But the only evidence from that is astronomical, right? What's the evidence for evolutionary biology? Chemical, geology, paleontological, mathematical, biological. It serves as the best vehicle to teach science, and it is the most robust science. If we say that evolutionary biology is wrong, that's an indictment of overall modern science, because scientific theory is the child of scientific inquiry across all fields.
Relative to predictability. About 20 years ago, I had a bet with a friend of mine. He was an evolutionist, I was an intelligent design supporter, about what they call junk DNA. About 90% of the genome, they believe, was junk. Introns, for example, you cut them out and genes work just fine. You take them out and they work. In fact, the system cuts them out. You have spliceomes and so on. It cuts out this DNA. So my prediction was, we don't know what it's used for, but my prediction based on intelligent design is that an intelligent designer wouldn't put 90% of the genome junk. He would put, there's a reason for it. So we had a bet basically where he said, this is junk, it'll always be junk. You take it out, it works just fine. Bergman, you're wrong. And I says, well, I might be, but my side was, I think we'll find uses for it. And therefore, I've been following this pretty carefully. And this article in the Wired magazine, which is a leftist magazine, by the way, clearly in favor of evolution, not that leftists are, but they are left politically. But anyways, what's the purpose of non-coding DNA? Human cell has more than 6 feet of tightly wound DNA. Only an inch that carries the code. So 6 feet, an inch is useful. He says, now we thought it was just along for the ride, okay? But they assumed that if it didn't have any function, it would rapidly incorporate mutations. But we're finding it did not. In fact, there are few mutations in this so-called non-coding DNA. Okay? Therefore, we now know it must be doing something. Now we're trying to figure out what it does. And now they have clear evidence that DNA produces the genes, okay, the coding DNA, and this so-called junk DNA are the nuts and the bolts of the system. The non-coding DNA is likely the assembly plans, the control systems. Unfortunately, he concluded, we spent 30 years thinking of it as junk, we've been misled, and just now we realize that we've been misled, and now we're learning how to read it. So I haven't quite won the bet with my friend, but I'm confident that I will be. By the way, I published an article 20 years ago in the American Scientific Affiliation Journal, which Francis Collins is part of. I know him, by the way, and we've talked about that. Francis Collins is a supporter of intelligent design. He's an intelligent design advocate, just in cosmology. In biology, he believes evolution explains it. In cosmology, intelligent design explains it. So he's half of an intelligent designer. He supports one half. And by the way, Miller at Brown University, he's the same thing. I read his book. And first part, I was appalled at. Second part, excellent. But I wonder if I assign the second part of his book, and I forget, what's his name? Finding Darwin's God. I wonder if I assign the second half of his book to my students, I wonder if I get in trouble for that. And I wonder if this debate, let's pretend, Judge, this debate was in a public school classroom. Now, if it was, I wouldn't talk about my religion. I'd pull all that out. But aside from that, would this be unconstitutional, what we're doing here? Would it be wrong for what we're doing here to take place in the classroom? My experience, these debates need to take place in the classroom. As I was mentioning earlier, I had one student that came into my biology class the first day and said, I want to tell you, I hate this class. I don't like biology, I don't like science, and I really don't like you. Nice first day. And she was defiant. She just sat there she was going to be a fashion designer. She sat there with a defiant look on her face. I would say about 4 or 5 weeks. All of a sudden, we got onto this stuff. She perked right up, and she changed as a student. She found all this, I don't know why, but she found it really interesting. I don't know what religion she is or if she had any. We didn't talk about that. But we talked about this issue we're talking about now. And she was turned on so much to science that she ended up taking another science course from me, which, considering what she said the first day, surprised me. But she's still going to be a fashion designer. I haven't quite got her that far to be a scientist, but it changed her way of looking at things. Why can't we allow these kinds of debates in a science class? And what you said about indoctrination, I fully agree. I would have a problem with any teacher indoctrinating students in either side. And that's what these books do. They indoctrinate in one side. I try to help students see both sides. I really stress critical thinking. And I think this is one area where we can help students develop critical thinking skills. And what I see going on in the schools today is indoctrination in one side. And what this does is it turns students off towards science. And they leave the science field. We wonder why so many students don't go into science. Because we turn them off because this subject is taught so dogmatically, they get turned right off and they leave and we never see them again. On the other hand, when we can present this, I can see, what time is it? 9 o'clock. We've only had 2 or 3 people leave. That's amazing to keep 7, 8, 9, that's what? 2 hours? We kept you, got no breaks, no intermission, no popcorn, nothing. We kept all of you alert for 2 hours. Can you imagine if we had these debates in the high school and in colleges, we'd keep students awake, alert for 2 hours and how much they'd learn? So what I'm saying is we need to debate this issue. And what I see is that the court decisions in the past have said, you teach one side, teach it dogmatically, don't cover the other side, otherwise risk your job, and that's it. And to me, the court decisions in the past have turned students off toward science, although I'm clearly opposed to indoctrinating students in religion or non-religion. And I think what we're doing now is indoctrinating students in non-religion.
I'd like to thank all of you for coming. I guess there were a long ways to go, both of them, especially Dr. Bergman. I really thank you very much for attending and all your excellent questions and participation. Thank you.
Thanks. I really appreciate your comments. You have been the most polite, most respectful person I've ever debated. You're number